The man missed the breaking news on TV in the time it took him to use the bathroom. An unknown virus, similar to rabies, was spreading across the globe at an alarming rate. Those infected would lose their sanity in a very short time and become extremely aggressive. Authorities urged all residents to stock up on supplies, go out less, and take the strictest precautions. However, Manel did not hear this doomsday warning. He went about his morning routine and left the house as usual. He only vaguely sensed that something was off in the city today. The sound of ambulance sirens on the streets was several times more frequent than usual. When he drove to the supermarket to shop, the scene before him left him even more puzzled. Every face in the supermarket was filled with anxiety and panic, and shopping carts were piled high with far more food and drinking water than people would normally need. It was as if everyone was preparing for a long siege, frantically sweeping goods off the shelves. Although Manel found it strange, his indifferent nature kept him from looking into it further. He simply followed his usual shopping list, buying a few days' worth of food and some cat food. He then returned home in a daze amid the chaos. Manel's slow reaction was a true reflection of how countless ordinary people behave in the early stages of a disaster. It wasn't until a video call from his sister that night that he was completely jolted out of his numb routine. Manel's sister worked in a government department. This allowed him to access more insider information than ordinary citizens. The virus reported in the news during the day had been severely underestimated in terms of its seriousness. This was an unprecedented viral outbreak, spreading at an astonishing speed. Infected individuals would completely lose their humanity within just a few dozen seconds, turning into madmen who attacked any living thing. The military had already intervened, but the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. More crucially, his sister revealed a top-secret piece of information. The authorities had long anticipated the worst-case scenario and had built an impregnable safe zone in advance. As a family member of a government employee, Manel was eligible to enter this safe zone. Her sister had already arranged everything for her and urged her to be sure to catch the last flight tomorrow morning to meet up with her. On the other end of the line, her sister's anxious and trembling voice finally jolted Manel out of her dazed state. For the first time, she truly felt that the doomsday scenario she had only seen in movies had become a real, invisible beast, tightening its grip on the throat of the real world. Early the next morning, Manel hurried toward the airport, but in the short time he spent waiting in line to board, the ticketing system suddenly failed completely. The airport shut down all flight routes and stopped accepting any passengers. This news was tantamount to a death sentence for everyone stranded at the airport. With such a high population density here, the consequences would be unimaginable if even one infected person appeared. At that moment, her sister called again.
Please listen to me immediately. That was my process.
Looking at the chaotic scene before him, Manel realized this was no place to stay. He wanted to drive home, but found that the roads leading into the city were already completely blocked. He knew that staying any longer was not an option, so he decided to escape by bike. Although this decision was made out of necessity, it was the most rational choice at the time. In an apocalyptic environment, knowing when to give up and adapt can be more important than stubbornly holding on. This action also marked Manel's gradual transformation from an ordinary person dependent on modern civilization into a survivor relying on his primal instincts. But after finally making it back to his community, he found his neighbor's house surrounded by a large group of armed men. Before he could figure out what was happening, he witnessed a terrifying scene. The usually kind and friendly neighbor was now unrecognizable. He let out a terrifying guttural roar, as if he already saw the others as food. This was the first time Manel had come face to face with an infected person at such close range. The twisted face and violent posture laid bare the true horror of the virus before his eyes. All he wanted now was to get away from this terrifying place as quickly as possible. But the next day, his sister brought terrible news. Because an infected person had appeared in Manel's community, the authorities had decided to designate the entire area as a quarantine zone. Soon, the military would arrive to conduct a forced search and relocate all remaining residents to a centralized safe zone. Although quarantine sounds safe, in reality, it carries enormous hidden dangers. If even one person has an outbreak, the consequences would be unimaginable.
He spent the nights making phone calls just to get through them.
Before his sister could come to the rescue, Manel had to stock up on enough supplies, so he went to the nearby supermarket again. But this time, the scene was completely different from the day before. The shelves had already been ransacked and left empty. He could only pick up some biscuits that others had discarded in the corner. Just as he barely managed to fill his backpack and was about to leave, a terrifying scene unfolded. A police officer covered in blood suddenly ran over. Perhaps he had encountered something horrifying as he locked himself inside the supermarket. Before Manel could react, he saw another officer not far away being knocked to the ground by an infected person. Manel instinctively wanted to help, but unexpectedly drew the attention of the infected. Before Manel could recover, the sound of something crashing against the glass came from behind. The police officer who had hidden in the supermarket had now also turned into the same kind of monster. Looking at the bite marks on his own body, the fallen officer's eyes were filled with despair. After urging Manel to leave, he resolutely turned the gun on himself. Perhaps in the apocalypse, death is not the most terrifying thing. This incident had a profound impact on Manel. He completely abandoned all illusions and realized that this was no longer a crisis where he could wait for rescue, but a life or death struggle for survival. From this moment on, Manel's survival instincts were fully awakened. He understood that if he wanted to live, he could no longer rely on anyone else. He could only depend on himself. After sealing all the doors and windows in the house, he saw that the military had already begun to evacuate. Hearing the urgent knocking outside, Manel didn't dare make a single sound. It wasn't until the footsteps outside gradually faded away that he narrowly escaped his first ordeal. In the blink of an eye, half a month had passed, and with all the residents evacuated, this once bustling city instantly became a ghost town. Although Manel had managed to survive, he found himself facing a new predicament. His food supplies were running dangerously low, and he had to go out and try his luck. So, he fashioned some gear using fishing equipment, and began searching for supplies nearby. However, after searching several houses in a row, he came up empty-handed every time. Just as he was about to give up, he encountered an elderly man who also hadn't evacuated.
With milk.
It turned out that the old man's children had left before the disaster broke out, but because he was disabled in both legs, he was heartlessly abandoned here. He hadn't eaten for several days, and his situation was even more difficult than Manel's. However, it was precisely the appearance of this old man that brought a turning point to Manel's struggle for survival. Since he couldn't go outside, the only thing he could do every day was sit by the window and observe everything happening outside. He was like a living map, knowing the situation of all the neighbors around him like the back of his hand, and was well aware of which families had the habit of stockpiling food. Which family's basement might be hiding supplies. Although the old man was physically disabled and seemed like a burden, his wisdom and information became resources even more valuable than food. With the old man's guidance, Manel's search became much more efficient, and he no longer wandered around aimlessly like a headless chicken. He quickly found quite a bit of food, and even more surprisingly, in the garage of one of the houses, he unexpectedly discovered a motorcycle. This greatly expanded Manel's range of activity, and soon they had accumulated a large amount of supplies. In this vast, empty city, two strangers with no blood relation formed a temporary family amidst the ruins of the apocalypse. They supported each other, facing the cold and loneliness of the end times together. Life was hard, but with each other's company, things seemed to slowly get better. However, stability in the apocalypse was always fleeting. As the supplies in the surrounding areas were gradually scavenged clean, they soon found themselves once again in a desperate situation, running out of ammunition and food. Just as Manel was worrying about what to do next, they picked up a faint radio signal and learned that survivors were establishing a base at the mouth of the Arosa River, gathering those who, for various reasons, had not managed to evacuate. This news gave Manel hope. He invited the old man to go with him, but there was only silence on the other end of the walkie-talkie. Manel hurriedly promised that he would definitely take him away from this place, but the old man only murmured a few words before falling silent. Early the next morning, after packing his things and preparing to leave with the old man, Manel opened the door, only to be met with a heartbreaking scene. On the table was a note. In the final moments of his life, the elderly man chose not to burden this kind-hearted young man any longer. Loss is a lesson everyone must learn in the apocalypse. Manel saddened, accepted reality and set off alone toward the unknown place of hope mentioned in the broadcast. However, when Manel arrived at the highway exit described in the broadcast, he found it completely blocked by abandoned vehicles. He had no choice but to take a detour along a smaller road, but the roar of his motorcycle alerted the infected lurking in the shadows, who soon gathered into a terrifying horde of the undead. They began to chase after Manel, but fortunately, the motorcycle was fast enough to temporarily leave them behind. However, when Manel arrived at the stronghold, he found it had already fallen. He could only grip the throttle tightly and fight his way out as the infected swarmed him. Yet no matter how fast the motorcycle was, misfortune still struck first. Because there were too many severed limbs of the infected scattered throughout the forest, the motorcycle suddenly lost control and crashed heavily to the ground. Seeing the infected getting closer and closer, Manel had no choice but to continue on foot. Fortunately, there was a dock nearby. He quickly shut the door and hid inside. Although he managed to escape danger for the moment, he soon found himself at a loss. He hadn't expected that, on such a large dock, there wouldn't be a single boat. Just as he was feeling utterly hopeless, he spotted a motorboat floating on the water, not far away. Manel hurriedly drove the boat to escape from the area, but soon the motorboat stopped moving on the water. Just when he thought he was doomed, a light suddenly appeared not far away. Seeing this, Manel desperately called for help. However, when he saw who was coming, a strong sense of unease instantly surged within him. These people didn't look like government rescue workers. They seemed more like a group of outsiders taking advantage of the chaos. But at this point, Manel had no other choice and could only follow them back to the cargo ship. But as soon as he got on the ship, the captain brought a translator to question him about his background. When the translator heard Manel say he was a lawyer, a look of concern appeared on his face. Fortunately, Manel reacted quickly and hurriedly added that he also ran a solar panel company. Only then did Victor breathe a sigh of relief. He then quickly said something to the captain, who nodded and left after listening.
And also,
in this post-apocalyptic world where law and order no longer exist, being a lawyer is a useless profession, even one that draws people's disdain. Only those with some practical skills are not seen as burdens wasting food. Victor himself was only kept around because he was a pilot. Although Manel was also allowed to stay, he was not having an easy time. He was constantly shrouded in anxiety and fear. In recent days, he often saw survivors being rescued. but the next day those people vanished without a trace, as if they had evaporated from the face of the earth. Compared to the infected outside, humans were even more terrifying. That day he found the belongings of those survivors from the previous night on the deck, and immediately realized that those people had most likely been killed, and that he could be the next victim. Manel decided to slip away under the cover of darkness. While searching for the speedboat keys, he accidentally discovered several survivors tied up like livestock to an iron mesh, clearly having suffered a great deal. Seeing this, Manel hurried to untie them, but just then, a guard suddenly appeared and shot one of them dead on the spot. Just as the guard was about to attack Manel, Victor suddenly arrived, responding to the commotion, and took out the guard on the spot. Clearly he too realized that although he was temporarily safe here, he had no dignity or freedom. Afterwards, he quickly led Manel and another survivor to the speedboat, but just as they were about to leave, they were discovered by the guards on the ship. Amidst a hail of gunfire, the last survivor was also shot dead. Victor fired back to cover their escape, but was hit in the shoulder during the fight. Fortunately, they managed to start the speedboat and escape from that hellish cargo ship. After a night of fleeing, the two finally reached the shore, but Victor's condition was worsening, and he needed to go to the hospital immediately to have the bullet removed. Manel remembered that there was a hospital nearby with a helicopter, which might be their only hope of escape. But when they arrived at the hospital, they found that there was nothing on the helipad. Before they could react, their car was attacked by the infected. In a panic, Manel slammed on the brakes, finally throwing the infected off. Then grabbing the submachine gun they had brought from the boat, he took out all the infected around them. Although they ran out of bullets, it bought them enough time to get into the hospital. Because Victor was losing too much blood, Manel placed him on the operating table and then set out to look for medical supplies. But just then, he heard the sound of children playing in the ventilation ducts, which gave him hope once again. Maybe there were other survivors here. However, before he could find them, he was attacked by the infected again and had no choice but to retreat the way he came. But when he returned to the operating room, he found that Victor, who had been lying on the operating table, had disappeared. Outside, more and more infected were gathering, and the door to the operating room wouldn't hold much longer. Just at this critical moment, a hidden door nearby suddenly opened. It turned out that this was the children's ward of the hospital. Aside from the nurse who had just saved Manel, there were only a few children and one doctor left here. They found the injured Victor and brought him in to save him. While the doctor was operating on Victor, Manel also learned an important clue. The helicopter had been moved to the quarantine zone. But now, to get there, they would have to pass through an area full of infected people, and since they were also taking care of a group of children, it was almost an impossible task. Just as Manel was thinking of a solution, gunshots suddenly rang out from downstairs. Unexpectedly, the group of bandits from the cargo ship, while scavenging for supplies, had found their way here. If they were discovered, the consequences would be unimaginable. Now they had no choice but to leave immediately. They planned to escape through the hospital's burned-out boiler room at the back. They tried to get as close to the helicopter as possible. However, just as they were attempting to open a jammed iron door, an infected person suddenly burst out from behind it, knocking down the doctor who was at the end of the group. Although everyone quickly dealt with the infected, the doctor was still bitten. Knowing he didn't have much time left, he stopped the children who wanted to approach him, urged everyone to protect themselves, and then resolutely turned away, walking alone into the depths of darkness. The group, holding back immense grief, pressed on. They arrived at a warehouse filled with shelves, which was the only way to the helipad. But this place was also crawling with a large number of infected, so they could only proceed carefully, passing through one by one. However, just as Manel was about to lead the last child through, a shelf suddenly collapsed, and the loud noise instantly attracted the attention of the infected. In a panic, Manel could only hide in a nearby metal cabinet with the child in his arms. Seeing that the cabinet wouldn't hold much longer, a sudden burst of gunfire erupted outside. It turned out that the group of bandits had searched their way here and in passing, cleared out the zombies in the warehouse. They didn't discover Manel hiding in the cabinet, and simply took some supplies before leaving. Finally, they reached the last and most difficult stretch of the journey. In front of them, a short 100-meter open area was teeming with countless infected. Looking at the sturdy iron fences used as partitions along the walkway, Manel suddenly came up with a bold plan. He had everyone tie all the iron fences together to form a movable iron cage. The children hid underneath, while the adults pushed from outside. At first, this method worked, but as more and more infected gathered, the tremendous impact made it extremely difficult for them to push forward. After more than 10 minutes of desperate struggle, they finally, though narrowly, reached the large iron gate. They used the iron cage to hold the gate shut, then quickly unlocked it. Once everyone had rushed inside, they worked together to close the gate again. However, just as Victor started up the helicopter, a few infected still managed to slip through. Manel had no choice but to stay behind alone, to buy time for the helicopter to take off. But at that moment, the group of bandits was also drawn over by the deafening roar of the helicopter. Using overwhelming firepower, they fought their way through in a bloody assault. But it wasn't to help them, it was to threaten them to stop. Seeing that their chance at survival was about to slip away, a look of determination flashed in Manel's eyes. With just a glance, he and Victor reached a silent understanding. Countless infected surged in like a tidal wave, instantly overwhelming the group of bandits. Manel chose to release the infected, opting for mutual destruction, a ruthless law of the jungle, fighting evil with evil. Though cruel, it was the only way to protect his companions and fight for survival. Of course, Manel himself was also caught in danger, but Victor had already started up the plane. Just as they were taking off, the nurse dropped the soft pack and successfully pulled Manel onto the plane. On board, the still shaken passengers were finally safe for the time being. Cell phone signals gradually returned after the city was locked down, and Manel immediately called his sister. He excitedly shared with her that he had escaped the situation and would soon reach the safe zone she had mentioned.
No, Benjamin Harris.
Mother Nobel Kashan Ali says that you should not avoid that, so go and be the makers.
Before Manel could even ask why, 2 fighter jets roared past. Watching them disappear into the distance, the smiles on everyone's faces froze. They all realized with despair that the safe zone they had considered their last hope had likely already fallen. This kind of abrupt ending amplifies the sense of despair in the apocalypse to the extreme. In the face of a true apocalypse, there is no such thing as a safe zone. There is only fleeing from one desperate situation to the next unknown predicament.